Violence only attacks the body, but it is nonviolence that has the power to influence the soul and reshape it towards a peaceful future. Abhijit Naskar. Bending Not Breaking. Season 3, Episode 21. Sozin's Comet Part 4. Avatar Aang. And welcome back to another episode of Bending Not Breaking. I'm Sunshine.
And this is Ben.
And we are Maxless this episode,
Oh,
which is
no.
he's fine, he's good, he's here, but I think we've got what to have a guest to kind of be in place of Max. I think we've got probably one of the best ones that we can have.
I agree, especially on like the season finale, y'all. This is big.
The season finale. So much happens in this like 23-minute arc, and I can't wait to talk about it. Ben, who do we have here today?
Y'all, I am so excited to share that we have Andre Henry with us. Andre, how are you?
I'm doing okay. Thanks for having me.
Of course. No, goodness. We are so grateful to have you. Like, oh, God. Like, thank you for blessing us with your presence and your wisdom and knowledge. So, Andre, y'all, has been, and I'm not going to talk for him, but I'll let him talk a little bit about himself. But one of the things that I definitely want to highlight is that Andre is an activist, and you can find him at Hope and Hard Pills. You can search for that. He has a podcast with a lot of amazing guests on it, really doing great work in fighting, all the racist, patriarchal things that are going on right now in this country. And so, Andre, you, what can you tell us just about you? How did you get started? Tell us just a little bit of a glimpse into your story and what is guiding you right now.
Yeah, for sure. So, I primarily identify as an artist. I've been making music for most of my life, and my art kind of turned political in 2016 when I watched a man named Philando Castile bleed to death on Facebook Live after being shot by a police officer in Minneapolis. And I made a commitment that day to study everything that I can about systemic racism, to pursue the question of how do ordinary people work together to change the world, just like my ancestors, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis and Fannie Lou Hamer and others, and that I would invest my body in the struggle for racial justice. And since then, I have found myself reading a ton of literature about nonviolent struggle, meeting people who have become friends, who have led revolutions, who have toppled dictators, who have started international movements, and trying to share that information that I've gained on that serious intellectual quest as often as possible through my writing and through my music and through speaking and through trying to continue organizing actions of my own.
I love it. Yeah. And listening to your music has been really, I think the word is invitational for me. Like I hear it and I feel, one, invited in, and two, it's like a mixture between a call to action and an invite into, and I just feel really moved by it. So I highly recommend people to seek that out. I think it's been really special to be a part of that.
Thank you.
Certainly. I don't know. I don't know if we've talked about it offline, but I was a music major in college, so I was a vocal performance, and so
no, I did not know that.
Yeah. So I have a real appreciation for that.
Yeah.
I did advertising, which I don't use that degree. That was $50,000 in student loans that I maybe shouldn't have taken out. But no, I think one that work is so crucial, right?
Yes.
Which is an understatement of the century. And I feel like we deeply see that throughout Avatar, which is one of the reasons it's so compelling, is this this fight for people and this fight for belonging and balance, and so where's your Avatar journey begin? How did you get into watching the show and finding it a place with this community or this fandom.
Well, I mean, Avatar was on the air so long ago that I don't remember how I started watching it. All I remember is I remember after it had gone off the air, I found these DVDs, I think at Barnes & Noble, and I was like, oh man, I need these. And and so that was like in 2009, I think it was, maybe a little later, possibly a little later. But anyway, I got those DVDs, and since then I've just watched the series multiple times.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. Cool. Yeah, I mean, the last episode aired in 2008 in May, I think, ish.
Yeah.
So that's awesome.
Yeah.
So you've been in it from the beginning almost, which is really cool.
Yeah, I was seeing it when it was on the air, and then I don't remember if I finished it the first time when it was on the air, but I definitely remember like just really loving the show. And when I found those DVDs,
sure.
I was like, oh my gosh, I need to watch this again. And it's so funny.
Now
like,
I'm for sure in.
At the time when I was watching it on the DVDs, I was going through like a lot in my life, and I was like, man, this story is so deep, like,
yes.
I just think that obviously just the narrative arc of the characters and all that, like, I think is just one of the best that has ever been done on television. But
here.
in addition to that, I think that there is so much spiritual depth. There's so much political, like, I don't know what you would call it, like, but there's something about like the political, the way that it depicts politics is what I'm saying, national politics.
Certainly it's a political commentary.
Yes,
for sure.
exactly. And then
I mean, half the fandom tells us not to put politics into this, and that's always been my struggle. It's been like, I don't know how to put anything into the show that isn't already there.
How can you not? Like, it's
right?
clearly like depicting imperialism, international politics, all this kind of stuff.
For sure.
It's part of the show,
Exactly.
It's like the crux of this narrative has to do with what the Fire Nation is doing. So that part. But then after my quest into nonviolent struggle, I started seeing it through another lens when I watched it again as well, and thinking about, how these people who are basically fighting off oppression, imperial oppression, like how they go about doing that, and especially with the solution of how Aang deals with Fire Lord Sozin.
Yeah. So let's talk about this for a second. So I asked you, hey, what lens do you want to look at this episode through? Mm-hmm. And you responded with, let's do it through nonviolent struggle.
Yeah.
And so I would love it if you could help us. Let's capture what nonviolent struggle is. What is nonviolent struggle? And then we might have a few follow-up questions based off what you say.
Great. Let's define nonviolent struggle as briefly as possible. And one way that I like to do this is by saying that nonviolent struggle is a way that ordinary citizens fight against social injustice, social oppression, and without the use of weapons and without causing other people harm, like physical harm. I think that's the easiest way to define that, because there's so much that could be said.
For sure. Okay. I have follow-up questions.
Okay, let's do it.
Let's go. Let's dive in.
Let's go.
Go ahead.
I think for me, to define violence is probably the important part, especially as we are in a slew of political season where we're seeing nonstop ads, kind of being pushed out that are like the violence in America, and there's violence everywhere, and Joe Biden's America, and there's and like all of these things, and all of these protests are violent, and and the reality is, there was even an article that just came out, or a study that just came out, that said 93% of these protests have been just completely peaceful.
Yep.
But when you ask the average American, I think it was 48% are saying like, no, they're violent.
Yeah.
And this idea of what is violence versus like what is uncomfortable and like what is something that we don't like.
Yes.
But definitely isn't violence, but because we're not oppressed, this discomfort or like this inconvenience feels like violence to us.
Right. Yeah, this is a.
So where's that? What is that line?
This is something that is really important to me because I feel like when people hear nonviolence, contemporary people hear the term nonviolence, they mean a lot of things that I'm not referring to. And one of those things is that, and this is kind of an old problem, like Thoreau and Tolstoy and Dr. King and Gandhi were all writing about this, that for a long time people think of nonviolence as inaction. All right, so when you get down to asking people, well, what do they mean when they mean to go about things peacefully or nonviolently? Like at the end of the day, you'll end up with pretty much nothing. This is like
we actually we don't want you to inconvenience our lives in any way, shape, or form, and so anything outside of that was going to feel violent.
Yeah,
so just don't do that, right?
This is
like that's the response.
This is the Colin Kaepernick thing, where he's like he's kneeling on the field, and people are like, well, he shouldn't be doing that. It's like, well, do you want for him to, go break a window at Bank of America to get your attention? Obviously not. Do you want for him? They're like, just protest like at home when no one can see you or hear you. Is basically like what people want for him to do. So anyway, that's one thing that we need to make a distinction that that nonviolent struggle is actually active and it's disruptive. It actually seeks to disrupt the status quo, just without causing physical harm to anyone. Another question in this, like what people bring up is like, well, what does that mean about property, right? Like, can you call yourself doing a nonviolent protest or nonviolent struggle if you're setting cars on fire, breaking windows, throwing rocks or whatever? And I would say that no, that's not really the kind of, sure, there's some people who could make some philosophical arguments about property and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, typically in nonviolent struggle, you're not destroying property either. So when we talk about nonviolent struggle, we're talking about things like boycotts, strikes, marches, sit-ins, making signs and posters, chanting songs, all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
I feel pretty solid about that definition, kind of moving forward. The Google, the Google definition, which we've realized in past episodes is not necessarily one that's all-encompassing. It's typically written by, whoever is
Google,
the deemed worthy, right? The patriarchy or typically old white people who've decided what a definition is. The practice of achieving goals, social change through symbolic protest, civil disobedience, economic and political non-cooperation, or other methods while being nonviolent, violence being a behavior that's physical force intended to hurt, damage, or kill someone or something.
Yeah, that's a pretty good definition.
We'll take it. The second part of violence is the unlawful exercise of physical force or intimidation by the exhibition of such force. And to me, it's the unlawful part of that is like, what a vague term, especially in a time where you're looking at it now, where it's like, well, so if police officers do it and it's not deemed and they're not being held accountable for it, does that make it lawful? So it's not violent, so it's cool?
Yeah.
Or is it? And then if you react to them bringing force onto you, like one of those, I think about back at the riots back in Ferguson where they threw the tear gas back at the police.
Yeah.
And then you have, that was attempted, murder on an officer or deadly weapon on an officer, and you're like, are you kidding me?
Yeah, like the violence of the violence of the state is often invisible to the general public, and that's something that we have to work against as people who are committed to nonviolent struggle, is to expose the violence and the brutality of the state as something that is unjustifiable, something that is unreasonable, something that needs to change.
Absolutely, and even as we go back to the aforementioned article that came out, I can't remember who put it out or the study that came out, but it was 54% of those peaceful marches were met with some form of police action. And so if you're going, well, if 93 of them were peaceful, why did 54 of them result in gas or any other form of protest, breakup, or violence towards the people.
I mean, the short answer is that the police are paid to stop people who want to change the status quo. Like it's a part of their job is to protect the status quo, and the tools that they have to do that are tools for war. That's why they're using tear gas and guns and light cannons and sound cannons and tanks and helicopters and all this entire arsenal of violence.
Oof, there's a lot there. I'm really excited to now kind of bring this to the episode and like dive into these really important points about how we see it happen in this episode. So, Sunshine, you have the
That's
privilege
not true, Ben. It is your turn for the 30-second recap. Ben,
episode.
Ben, your
It's
turn.
your turn.
It's your turn. It's an odd episode.
No,
We've
no,
had this
odd
conversation
episodes are your
every
responsibility.
time. And away we go.
Okay, so here's what happens. Ozai unlocks Aang's chakra, like the best chiropractor ever, causing him to enter the Avatar state, and then boom, thank you, ma'am, takes him down. Order of the White Lotus successfully liberates Ba Sing Se. Sokka and Toph, disable all the airships. Katara defeats Azula, heals Zuko. All the things happen, and then newly appointed
5 seconds.
They wins, and the Phoenix Coast goes down, and then Zuko is Fire Lord, and
3,
then Aang's happy, and then
2,
Aang and Katara kiss.
1.
It's great.
Aang and Katara kiss. It's great. We love it.
Yeah,
we love to see it. Because then in all the comics they get all
I always
oogie
do
and like call each other sweetheart on a regular basis.
Sweetie.
And it's
yeah.
I don't love it. It fits them.
Oh,
but,
I think it's so on brand. Yeah,
For them, it's
But
I just don't. I'm on the Sokka Toph side.
After doing a season's worth of 30-second recaps, I realized that I am really good at the front half and then really good at speedily running through the second half and skipping half the details.
Get through the first 15 minutes of the show, and then the final is, and then the rest of the episode happens.
Yeah.
So, but let's talk about as we look through this episode. And Andre, we'll throw it to you first. What's a giant moment for you of nonviolent struggle?
Well, it really is the way that Aang decides to defeat Ozai. He's agonized over the fact that he does not want to just kill the Fire Lord. And he has talked to every avatar that he can pull, that he can manifest from the past to try to tell him that he doesn't have to. And his decision to take away Ozai's ability to bend rather than to kill Ozai is, part of the reason why I love this show so much, and partly why I wanted to do this through the lens of nonviolent struggle.
Yeah, this moment's so big, and it's a huge climactic point. And I think it's really interesting, and part of the reason it's so climactic is because Aang's legacy, his inheritance, if you will, by means of all the past avatars, leads him to take Ozai's life. All of them are like, you gotta do it. You gotta do it.
Yes.
This is the hard part, but sometimes you gotta make tough decisions.
Yeah.
And Aang, we see him he's about to take him down. He has all 4 elements spiraling down towards Ozai, and then Aang says no. And I find that to be really compelling because that moment is, throughout the series we've said the Avatar state is where Aang has lost control. He goes into Avatar state because he has lost control of his emotions. He's lost control of he's just overwhelmed in the moment. Fear, whatever it may be. And I think this signifies, in a way, emotional mastery, because he is able to step out of that, quote, violent act.
Yes.
And we see him this is the peak of an immensely emotional moment, and he steps out of it, and it's just his ability to step out here to stop before killing Ozai is just a testament to his growth over the past these 3 seasons.
Yeah. Well, there's a classic argument that is enacted through this scene where, Ozai, when Aang initially says he's not going to kill him, Ozai's response is, you're weak, and so he's going to try to now give Aang the death blow, right?
Yeah.
And this is what people say about nonviolence all the time. Like this, like violence is just the way of the world. No battle has ever been won without bloodshed. No people have ever liberated themselves without bloodshed. You know, you just have to do it. And this is what the other avatars were telling Aang. But Aang,
Kyoshi was.
Oh yes, Kiyoshi's like, I don't even see the difference in what you're saying. You know, between you know, like
I don't understand why this is a difficult decision for you.
Yeah, right. So that's a classic argument between violence and nonviolence. And Aang turns around with this creativity, this nonviolent creativity, and removes Ozai's resources, his ability to wage violence, and that is the essence of nonviolent struggle that so many ordinary people don't know about. So when we think about nonviolence in our contemporary society, everybody thinks that basically it's about, first off, espousing that you're against violence and then doing nothing basically to people who do want to do violence, or doing a march on the sidewalk so it doesn't interrupt traffic, or putting a Black Lives Matter sign in your window or something like that, right? But what Aang does is remove his resources. And this is something, if anyone reads the literature on nonviolent struggle, like this is a classic, this is the grand strategy of nonviolent struggle, is you identify what your oppressive opponent, what are the resources that they need in order to carry out their oppression, and how can ordinary people remove those resources through their non-cooperation with the status quo.
Wow. So I'm in a class right now. And one of the themes of it is the difference between charity and justice.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And my argument is that charity is addressing the symptom, whereas justice addresses the cause of said system.
Yes.
Right. Of said symptom.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me like the removal of resources is justice, right?
Yes.
Versus treating, you're suffering from, firebending attack. Let me help you by providing you these like, I'm going to give you all these resources to help you continue to endure.
Right.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like charity, if you will. And so like, it's interesting to me because nonviolent struggle, and as you said, this being like the grand example of what this could look like. What I hear you saying is that the element of creativity to consider how you remove those resources to enact justice is really crucial.
Yeah,
right?
Well, at the end of the day, like there has to be some kind of okay. Basically, we're talking about imagination, right? Of course, it's going to take some creativity, because those who engage in nonviolent struggle usually do so because they have no choice, right? So like when people talk about ending systemic racism by taking up arms, I'm always like, that's never going to work, right? Because you're talking about taking on the U.S. military, right? You don't have the kind of firepower and you don't have the kind of firepower and arsenal to do that. And so one thing that limitations always they demand creativity. And so the oppressed, who are severely under-resourced, like these people who are fighting the Fire Nation, Sokka, Toph, Aang, Momo, Appa, like they don't have the resources to take on the Fire Nation in that way. So that's one thing that I'm saying, that creativity is always the offspring of limitations. And people who have to engage in nonviolent struggle are often have to do so because they are limited. And so therefore it requires a creativity to figure out, okay, well, we don't have the firepower to hit our enemy where they are strong, and they are strong at doing like conventional warfare. But we do have the resources to prevent them from continuing to maintain their oppression, their oppressive hold on us. And so that's how you end up getting these like very creative actions throughout history, like in the Philippine Revolution, for instance, like the army comes out with their tanks and their guns and all this kind of stuff. And then you have thousands of ordinary Filipinos who come out with cheeseburgers and orange soda, and they're yelling with smiles on their faces at the soldiers, saying, "What are you doing up there shooting at your neighbors? You should come down here and eat with us,"
Yes.
So Yeah, there is a huge element of creativity and a huge element of imagination, because usually when you say, hey, we've got to go about this another way, the first thing that people say is, well, what else are we going to do? You know, that's why people say things like the only way that you're going to be able to free yourselves is by taking up arms or guerrilla warfare or by killing all the white supremacists or something like that, right? And you have to have people who have another kind of imagination or the ability to imagine winning by some other way.
And we see when we're looking at Aang in this moment, I think you see him living into his values, which is something that we kind of talk about all the time. Is that him understanding and having enough self-awareness to kind of say, murdering Ozai is not a part of my value system.
Yeah.
It's not something that I'm going to justify or try to finagle. This isn't what I want. This isn't my value system, and it takes a lot of courage, and it is tough to be able to kind of say, no, I'm gonna act inside of my value system right now at arguably one of the most difficult points to do so.
Yeah, I also think that Aang is struggling with the fact that if he kills Ozai, that's going to be on his conscience the rest of his life, right? And so there's this huge question that Aang seems to be asking himself, which is, no matter what everybody says is necessary, who will I have to become in order to carry this out, right? And that is such an important question for people who want to change the world. When we ask about the means by which they're going to go about doing it, is like, sure, like you can make the argument that in order to break off violent oppressors that you need to use violence, but who will you become in the process of taking those kinds of means?
Question. So, one of the arguments I foresee happening when people listen to this is, but this is an inherently violent episode. The whole episode is fighting.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
And so I'm struck by this perception that like nonviolent struggle has no violence, right? And so like what I'm seeing is that violence is in this episode is a response to the loss of safety. All of the fighting on behalf of the Aang and the gang are it's defensive, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the things you say is the oppressed cannot be blamed when the oppressors refuse to engage with nonviolent actions in diplomatic conversations.
For sure.
Right?
Yeah.
That's a you quote. So can you elaborate on that?
Well, when I talk about nonviolence, I'm not talking about morality, right? There are so many people throughout history who have talked about nonviolent struggle on the basis of what is moral, what is immoral, all that kind of thing, and I respect them. But I'm talking about nonviolent struggle as a strategy, you know, a weapon system that doesn't involve conventional weapons, right? And in that sense, so on that note, I can say that like those people who find themselves needing to take up arms in some way in self-defense, like I also respect that position, you know. It's just not something that I'm able to organize personally. And so that quote that you quoting me is really me paraphrasing Nelson Mandela, who actually said that about the apartheid regime, where he said, listen, like the oppressed cannot be blamed if their oppressors aren't going to respond to nonviolence. And so I agree. Actually, throughout the show of Avatar, there is tons of violence, right? From this same group that ends up defeating Ozai nonviolently. And that was Aang's choice. So, I mean, one thing that I think of is Eric McBay's work. He's released a 2-volume book called Full Spectrum Resistance. And he talks about how in movements for social progress, there are all kinds of different groups, and all of them take on different roles. And some people take on more radical actions, like what we see Toph and Sokka doing. They're engaging in acts of sabotage, right?
Yeah, they are.
Like they're destroying enemy ships and things like that, right?
Taking down blimps.
Yeah.
Suki's helping.
That moment where Toph is hanging by Sokka's fingertips, well,
and you have to, like, and she can't see in that moment.
She can't see. She's got no way to. She's
lost her sense of
she's
sight.
Feeling him in this moment, and that. The tears. The tears.
You know, and so the argument that Eric McBay is making in his book is that, you know, people who engage in those acts of sabotage and stuff like that, like they have a role in revolutions sometimes, and I think that's true in thinking of America's revolution that founded America, like taking all that British tea and dumping it into the harbor, that was an act of sabotage. It was destructive, but it had its
Absolutely.
role, and so it's not something that I advise people to do. Like I wouldn't advise people to go trying to like sabotage, I mean, for instance, like I'm like, going and making sure, I don't know, like slashing police tires or something like that. Like I would not advise people to do things like that. And at the same time, like there are these instances in history where people have engaged in radical actions, and those have been a part of the movements for social justice. I mean, think of the women's suffrage movement in America. Like those women were not talking about how can they make sure that they don't make anyone upset or that they don't hurt anybody.
Yeah.
Like they were throwing down, to get the right to vote.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it has its place, and usually it has its place when the press people have been backed into the corner so much that they feel like they don't have any other recourse.
Yeah, so that really speaks to this moment with Aang, right? So one of the things the lion turtle says to Aang is that if you try to take someone's bending, like your spirit risks being corrupted and destroyed, right? And so Aang takes a massive risk by taking the nonviolent route. Like he's at personal risk, not because he's not powerful enough to take Ozai down literally with his bending, but because his spirit risks being corrupted if he goes the nonviolent route, if he isn't strong enough. And so what I'm hearing and what I'm reading from that analysis and from what you're saying is it takes so much more, you said creativity before, but also so much more courage to do this, to take the nonviolent route than it does to take his life. Like taking his life is the easy way out, it seems like. So to take the source of his oppressive power and imprison him seems like a much more challenging prospect.
Nonviolent struggle is very challenging. Some people like to think of it as though it's weak, and usually it's because they're thinking of inaction as nonviolent struggle. But even Gandhi said that, like, he can take a violent person and he can train them to be nonviolent. But at the end of the day, if the choice is between nonviolence and inaction, if the choice is between violence and inaction, it would be better to choose violence, which is a Gandhi quote, and King repeated it as well. And so, but to be nonviolent, it takes a lot of training and it takes practice, because that's not our natural inclination. Our natural inclination when we are being attacked is to use force to defend ourselves. And so this is why, like, civil rights activists actually gathered to practice how to maintain nonviolent discipline, because it takes courage, first off, because you are going to get a violent response. Like this myth that, like, if you do it peacefully, quote unquote peacefully, which is probably why we shouldn't even use the word peaceful, because nonviolent struggle is meant to disturb the peace. But if you do it nonviolently, this myth that if you do it nonviolently that the powers that be will handle you gently is just wrong. They beat up old women and students and pastors in the 1950s and 60s for peacefully, nonviolently confronting the Jim Crow situation. So that's one thing. So that's why it takes courage, because you will get a violent response, but it also takes a tremendous amount of discipline, and it takes a tremendous amount of self-restraint and hope, right? You have to believe that the people watching you, or the people that will see this thing, will be able to recognize the violence of the state, right? That it will reveal the violence of the state for what it is.
And I think we see that right now. We've seen moments, especially with the rise of social media and Twitter and TikTok and all these ways for us to capture those moments, are moments of instigation from the state, waiting for that violence response to trigger then what is a justified violent response in that moment, because they attacked us, even though we see that instigated over time.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, I mean, it's tough to hear that conversation. And we witness Aang, like, Ozai's trying to break into that rock ball at the beginning of the episode like it's a Nestle Wonder Ball with sprinkles inside. And you get backed into that corner, and how it's tough to be creative or imaginative in that moment right there where it's like, is this life or death? Is this it? Is this the end?
Right.
And so how do we stay that way?
Well, I think that the issue, the truth of it is that Aang has been training for that his whole life. You know?
Yes, that's what I was gonna say.
Whenever you see Aang fighting throughout the series, like, he typically is evading and trying to wear his opponent down. Right now, I'm not gonna lie. There are some moments where I'm like, I don't know if we can say that Aang was being nonviolent. Like the when he goes into the Avatar state and becomes this water monster. I can't remember what season that is, but
giant water koi, season 1, end of season 1.
Yeah, at the end of season 1, at the Northern Water Tribe, like, I don't know if we can say that Aang took a nonviolent response, because I don't know what happened to all those soldiers. Like, did he drown all those people, at the Northern Water Tribe? But for the most part, when we see Aang fighting, Aang is usually not, trying to actually, like, directly, blow someone off a cliff, right? Or into a canyon or something like that, right?
Yeah, for sure. 2 points. One, that is a recurring theme on a lot of the Facebook groups and social media things, talking about, like, Aang actually has killed a lot of people. I have an argument against that.
Okay.
And I believe that being the Avatar means he is also, because he is also so connected with the spirits, I believe that what actually potentially killed those people is the ocean spirit in response to losing the moon.
Interesting.
And so I think that Aang was the vehicle through which that occurred. And I because as we have been saying, I think that's pretty intensely out of character for Aang to do something like that.
Mm-hmm,
and so that's kind of my, headcanon, if you will, regarding that. And 2, I wanted to circle back to what you were saying about how it requires discipline to be nonviolent.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that one of the things that I don't want to miss is that for 3 seasons, we have watched Aang be intensely disciplined in regards to having to learn 4 elements.
Yeah.
And like, we had to learn airbending, had to learn waterbending, earthbending, firebending. He struggled with almost all of those things.
Yeah.
He had to, like, seriously temper how he was working emotionally with all these. We talked at the beginning about his emotional growth and how he was able to step out. Like, the amount of work that Aang put into this, I think, is something that we really need to focus as a case study in terms of nonviolent struggle, because you mentioned that we need the discipline and the training, and
Yes.
2, we see Aang as a model for that, and I think that's really important to highlight.
Yeah, absolutely. And the more people, so, like, if we're not trained for nonviolent struggle, what we're gonna do is default to whatever our instincts are, And so we have to we have to develop the skills for nonviolent struggle. We have to develop the instincts for us to fight nonviolently and to fight well nonviolently.
So, question.
Mm-hmm.
I have lots of questions for you, like the whole time. So I have another quote from you, and this may be you paraphrasing somebody else, but I have it attributed to you. But your quote is, "If we flatten people into pure villains, we may be setting ourselves on a trajectory for violence rather than restorative justice."
Yes.
And so I find this really compelling because we talk all the time on this show about assuming the best in people.
Yeah.
And what is the hypothesis of generosity, right? And one of the things that I think allows Aang to make the nonviolent choice in this moment is to see Ozai as deserving, like, he is human. He deserves the same human dignity that we would give our neighbor, if you will.
Yes.
Right? So the whole idea of loving your neighbor kind of as a concept. So can you kind of can you speak to that for me?
Well, yeah. Excuse me. So in principled nonviolence, and that's the type of nonviolence that Gandhi and King practiced, While I'm at it, I just want to maybe circle back to just another question that when we talked about like how I don't poo-poo on oppressed people who feel like they need to, they need to do the more radical actions, or if they feel like they need to take up arms or whatever. Like I don't poo-poo on that because that's their decision to make.
Sure.
But in principled nonviolence, that's why I want to just contrast those things. And I'm talking about strategic nonviolence. In principled nonviolence, you have people like Dr. King, like Gandhi, and one of the things that they say is that, well, there are a couple things. One is that we're not fighting against people. We're fighting against systems of oppression. We're fighting against powers, and so that allows people who are engaging in nonviolent struggle to see the people who are standing in direct opposition to them as full human beings. And a part of the goal for principled nonviolent activists or people who are practicing principled nonviolent struggle in the way of King or Gandhi or whatnot is that after the struggle is over, they want to be able to sit down with the same people who were in opposition to them in beloved community. They want to be able to have community with them. Another activist named Srđan Popović, who led the movement that overthrew Slobodan Milosevic in the year 2000 in Serbia, Srđan talks about how, like, okay, if you take up armed struggle, okay, this is why I'm kind of going in a spiral here, but this is also why I wanted to circle back to the distinction between like this strategic nonviolence and principled nonviolence, is because I appeal to nonviolence not because I think it's morally superior, although it may be. I appeal to it because it is strategically more advantageous than trying to go about it any other way. And part of the reason is one that Srđan highlights, and that is that after someone tries to go through a violent revolution, you've got all these people who are sore after the revolution happened because the revolution killed their dad or their brother or their family. And so now within a few years, you've got a bunch of people who want to start the violence up again just in revenge killings, which is why a lot of times violent revolutions lead to civil war within 10 years, right? Gosh, why was I going down this rabbit trail again? What was the question again? I'm going to be able to land this.
The original question was if we flatten people into pure villains, we may be setting ourselves up, right?
Okay, so the goal in principled nonviolence is you want to be able to be in community with these people afterward, right? And that's why I brought up, Srđan and, violence leading to all these revenge killings. Like, it continues the cycle of violence, right? And so a part of what Aang is able to do, and he doesn't just do this with Ozai, he does it with Zuko too. So it's like very consistent with his character throughout the series, is that Aang really does believe that people deep down have some good inside of them, or that they're at least worth keeping around, right? Like that we don't just...
We see that as early as the Blue Spirit episode in season 1, where he's like, hey, I think we could be friends, right?
Exactly. So that we don't just throw people away, because they do bad things, right? Dr. King was... early Dr. King spoke a lot about this when he spoke about the white people in the Jim Crow South who were so controlled by these anti-black ideas that they would lynch black people and hate black people and keep them from entering their businesses and stuff. In a sermon where he says that they're not bad people, they're blind people. And so I think that Dr. King may go a little bit too far sometimes, because he in one sermon he says we will meet your capacity to do violence with our capacity to endure violence, and I'm like, what was that? What was the air in the sanctuary like in that when he said that in the congregation?
Yeah.
But there still is this thing in principled nonviolence where people do want to make this distinction to not flatten people and to say that, they are defined, like Brian Stevenson says, they're defined by the worst things that they've ever done.
Yeah.
Well, and how does that really relate to what, like, the quote-unquote cancel culture that you hear about, right? When I honestly think of J.K. Rowling, who has been given multiple opportunities to learn and grow and have a chance to change your language around a community of trans individuals, and
has only
and continues
continued to
like
dig
double
the hole.
down,
Yeah.
each time I feel like she gets that opportunity. And so, where is there a line? Is there a boundary? Is there a place
Yeah.
where it's you've kind of lost your seat at the table because we've tried?
I think that
And what does that look like?
I think that cancel culture is a complex thing that we're talking about, because on the one hand, it is completely valid for oppressed people to decide we are not going to engage with these people who cause us harm, know that they're causing harm, and don't show any signs of changing. That's valid, right?
Here.
And so I think that it's up to people who are, okay, when we talk about like Christians love like this thing, let me back up a little bit. So we know about the scripture where Jesus says to turn the other cheek, right? And I'm like, it's up to the person who's been slapped to decide what they're going to do, right? That decision is up to them. And so I'm not
Just for funsies, I'm in divinity school, so I am very familiar with this, and I'm not even Christian, so it's one of those things where like I'm familiar with it, but I don't think everyone is. Can you can you give us that full picture?
Yeah.
So
Jesus is talking to his disciples in what they call the Sermon on the Mount, and he tells them, if someone slaps you on one cheek, turn the other one to them. I don't remember the exact quote.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people bring this up when we're talking about nonviolent struggle. And, the point that I'm making is that we have to let oppressed people do what serves for their liberation, and they get to decide what that is. So that's one side of the coin when it comes to cancel culture. On the other side, like, I think that things like prison, solitary confinement, the death penalty, like all of those are also cancel culture to me. And I think that those things are just morally wrong, right? Like, I think that when somebody does something that is wrong or criminal or whatever, like, our default position should not be to just throw them away. Now, when we're talking about like someone like J.K. Rowling, who, says, who is not honoring the harm that is being named by that community, I think that trans people get to decide. Yeah, I think it's totally valid for them to say, you know what, we're not buying her books, we're not listening to her, all that kind of thing, because she knows that we're causing us harm. Now, at the same time, I think that there are some people who probably know J.K. Rowling more personally who need to take responsibility for trying to help her to really understand the harm that she's causing and not give up on her, in the sense that they, try to help kind of move her from that place. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's totally not the responsibility of the people who are being directly oppressed, but the people who have the privilege to be kind of the ally, if you will, right?
Yeah.
Is that a good comparison?
Yeah, for sure. And I think of some people like, at the end of the day, I just think that people need forgiveness. People need redemption. I think that is a human need, and if people have to go on living after they've done something harmful, then they need some way that they can have a second chance at life, right? But I do think that we need to make sure that that's qualified in some way, right? So it's not that we just call it water under the bridge just because it's in the past, or just because we all, do harmful things, or because we all make mistakes. Like, I don't think we just gloss over it. And at the same time, I don't know. I think that it applies differently to different people. We have people in America who they are living with a scarlet letter on their lives called a felony, right? Because they did something, and
absolutely,
they've been disenfranchised from voting, or it's hard for them to find a job or housing or whatever. And I think that kind of cancellation is wrong. And then
let's use Zuko as a model for that. I don't mean to interrupt, but Zuko's a really good model for that, where we see he's an upstander. He is a member of the oppressing party.
Yep.
Right? He is canceled, like literally banished and canceled, and he is trying his best, and it finally gets back in, and then he becomes this upstander and is saying, no, what is going on is wrong. And I think just Zuko, how good of a model for this is Zuko, right?
Yeah, I think so. Like, Zuko is such a great example, because I think that Zuko actually does deserve another chance. Well, actually, maybe deserve is not the right word, because like they would be totally justified to say, no, you never join Team Avatar, right?
Yeah, and we talked about that on the episode when he tries to join, for
Yeah.
sure.
But in letting him in, they give him this chance at redemption that I think that people actually need in order to live well. Now, but I don't think that automatically applies to everyone. And I think the reason why I think that it does apply to Zuko is because Zuko has this whole process where he's trying to take responsibility and trying to make amends.
Yeah, like the idea of reparation, if you will, right?
Yes.
And he does, and like those field trips with Zuko, in a way, like it's not a great comparison, but in a way, it's a form of reparation, if you will.
Yeah.
So I want, like, we've spent a lot of time talking about Aang and Ozai. I really want to make sure we don't forget this moment with Zuko, Azula, and Katara, right?
What moment? What could you possibly be talking about?
This giant piece of the episode, right? So, at this point, Zuko has already been lightninged,
Yep.
and he's down and out, and so Katara is now duking it out with Azula, and I love this moment because, frankly, how nonviolent is Katara in this moment, where she is literally running, she is defensive, she gets to the point where she then realizes there's water, she identifies the chains, and she is able to capture Azula and not, take her down, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that's a really, really neat moment of nonviolence, I thought.
Yeah,
And just unbelievably heartbreaking.
Oh,
Like that's one of
absolutely.
the first times that you just like full on just have empathy for the pain and fear and everything that is coursing through Azula.
Yeah.
As she's just like breathing fire.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I think
so much pain.
this is also to your other point about like flattening people. Like I think that Avatar does a
Yes.
really good job of showing us where Zuko is coming from the whole time, showing us eventually where Azula's coming from. Like you can assume that Azula is dealing with this, the same trauma or similar trauma to her brother, even though we don't get to see her arc. I think they kind of try to pack a lot into the Ember Island episode so that they're like,
Yeah.
do you get it? Do you get it now? Right? But I will say that like I think that this is a part of this like not flattening people where you can have this kind of compassion for Azula in that moment, because that like she comes from a messed up family. She's dealing with a lot of trauma. By the end, she's completely isolated herself. She doesn't trust anyone, and that ultimately leads to her ruin. I never thought about Katara's response as nonviolent, but I can see like she does a similar thing to Aang where she immobilizes her, right? She's not going in for the kill. She just wants to stop Azula from being able to to fight as she's been doing through the series.
Woo.
Another moment to me of that is King Boomy just throwing tanks on top of each other. Yep. Everyone kind of like gets away, and no one's like really harmed in the process. But there's then a tower of tanks that's kind of there afterwards, as where kids are playing soccer around it.
Yeah.
I think it goes all the way back to season 2 when he talks about like that neutral Jin and that like waiting for the right moment, but it's also not passive. It's kind of that more active moment. And so I love me some King Boomy. I like seeing him around, and the White Lotus Order.
Yeah, Boomy's like super lovable. Just love that guy, as well as Iroh. Like, these are just great characters in general.
Well, and talk about the redemption that comes to Iroh throughout this entire process, and we don't see all of the war and stuff that happens prior to the show beginning, but we know it's there, we know it exists, and Zuko talks about his complicated past, and we as a fan base love Iroh and his redemption.
For sure.
We love Zuko and his redemption, and we love those characters because they become good, and I wonder how often I personally don't even give that opportunity to other people when I I love these story arcs when it happens. I love these characters when it happens. We see the good in them, and how often have I shut people down or out because of that?
It's hard.
It's-
It's hard giving people, that space, and to, like when you are on the receiving end of that harm, like it's very difficult to step back and to consider, what people's motivations are. Right. And I know that like we talk a lot about in our culture how impact is more important than the intent often, and at the same time, there's a reason why there's a difference between murder and manslaughter. Right. Like I don't know how to resolve these two things, and to make it all line up in like a neat way to reconcile all these things. But these things can be true and stand in tension at the same time. And so, I mean, there have been people in my personal life who have caused a great deal of harm to me, who years later I'm able to look back and say, you know what, considering what they've been through, considering how they grew up, like I can understand why they were doing that. And even though it caused me a lot of harm, like I'm not going to hold this against them anymore. And then there are people who like, something may have happened like last month and I'm like, F that person, like, I don't know.
For sure. Absolutely. So one of the things that comes up as you talk is I'm just one of the phrases that has stuck with me is from my prior job was one of our 3 mandates, if you will, is to nurture the potential in every child. Mm-hmm. And that was we in youth development we were working with children, right? And so to nurture the potential in every child. Yeah. And I really that to me is a really great phrase when it comes to this concept is how do we nurture the potential for people, right? Yeah. And I think one of the things that like in order to forgive, I think it requires that we are considering the potential, right? It's and I think like there's this mass group of people who are like I wish we got this redemption arc for Azula. Yes. And I get it. And there's a lot of people who are like, nah, she's an unforgivable. And I'm like, but like, let's nurture the potential, right? And so for me, this concept of seeing the potential in people is really important. We do a great job of that. I think we are more forgiving, if you will, with children than we are with adults.
For sure.
I just as a side note, Nadia Boltz-Weber has a podcast called The Confessional. Yep. Where it's kind of related to this, where people like confess like they're the worst thing they ever did in their life. Mm-hmm. And it's just a really beautiful moment where they're able to say that this was my worst moment and here's where I am now. And often they've made great strides in in redeeming themselves. And I just think it's a neat podcast if you're interested in the concept.
Yeah, we all love a good redemption story, like usually in the abstract, usually in some kind of art or fiction, Yeah. And for certain people in society, but we don't always believe in those redemption arcs for everyone. And oftentimes those redemption arcs are not available to, Black and brown people who have been, convicted of crime or accused of crime. We live under a stigma of danger and criminality for most of our lives, and I know this is a completely different story I'm going to bring up, and we don't have to spend any time on it at all. But I have been thinking about it lately, and it's Les Miserables. I think about like people love that moment where Jean Valjean is caught red-handed stealing some silver from a church, and when the priest who owns the church, doesn't own but leads the church, sees him and is like, oh, you forgot these other silver things, so that he can throw the police off the trail. Like people love that moment, they applaud that moment, but embodying the thing that we celebrate in that moment, or embodying the thing that we celebrate in Avatar when Aang says, even though Ozai is a war criminal, I'm not going to kill him. That thing that we celebrate in Zuko, when Zuko finally realizes that the thing that he's been chasing like is actually not what it's all cracked up to be, and he's become a terrible person by pursuing it and decides to take a different path, is something that we as a culture, I don't think that's our common sense as a culture. Like we're not offering that to each other. And truth be told, it's the kind of I mean, in Christian terms, I can only speak to the Christian tradition. We call it grace, right? And it's not something that I see many people willing to offer to others, right? In that way, and for good reason, like,
Yeah.
it's not without, or I should say, it's not without reason that we don't. But I long for a world where we do.
Yeah, we almost got through a full episode without me mentioning Brene Brown, but I'm gonna.
We can't let that happen.
We can't let that happen. She talks about how vulnerability is the first thing we want to see in other people, but the last thing we want to admit that we have.
Right.
And this, to me, what you've been saying really strikes me as that argument. Like, we see this character, Jean Valjean, and all these characters like be vulnerable, and we want to see other people do that. But as soon as we are called to be vulnerable,
right,
we're like, nope, no, thank you. And it's the same thing with courage. Like, we name, like, what does it mean to be courageous, and then everybody names people being vulnerable, right? And so, like, oh, to sing on stage, to do these things, and like to love someone else, like, in what world is that not vulnerable, right? And so it's what you're describing to me, grace, if you will, is extremely vulnerable, and I think that's what makes it so difficult, right?
Yeah.
No, I absolutely. I think that's just, you get this moment where there's an inherent risk of being willing to kind of say, this is a person that's hurt me, or something that has hurt me, and I'm going to give them a chance to not do that again, but also in the same moment give them an opportunity to do that again, and that requires immense vulnerability.
Yeah.
And we hope that they lean to the side of Zuko or Iroh.
For sure.
And then, but that doesn't always happen, and so that's ugh.
And I think
it's messy, it's icky.
It is super messy, and I think it's worth saying that, like, to give someone grace, if you will, to give someone grace doesn't mean that you have to be the person that walks with them to their redemption story, right? Like,
I love that.
You know what I mean? Like, you can give someone grace and stay away from them for your own safety, because that's wisdom on your part. Like,
Here.
And just to reiterate, like, I wish that there was like a simple, clear-cut answer. And I don't think that there is. And that's partly why violence kind of gives us that kind of simplicity that helps us to avoid all of that, right? Like, because, oppressed people could just say, kill the oppressor, and we don't have to deal with, whether or not the oppressor will ever hurt anyone again. Just annihilate them,
Yeah.
But again, I think that Dr. King and others have a point when they say that if we try to handle things that way, like, we are perpetuating a cycle without end. It has to stop somewhere. And what that solution is, I mean, I don't know conclusively or universally or comprehensively, but that's why it requires imagination and creativity.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I want to be mindful of our time, and then I also want to make sure we hit this final thing, at least on my list, is,
your list is so important, Ben.
Whatever. But like, so it is not over after Aang defeats Ozai. And I think that's really important to highlight.
Yeah.
And Zuko gives a speech that, I just, like, tears during Zuko's speech. It's just, like, it's so what I want right now. It's what it's what I want from people right now.
You want a leader to give that speech?
Yes,
currently?
That's all I want. And so Zuko, like, says we're not done. We have a long history of oppression that we have to try and repair.
Yeah.
And he says it's not going to be easy. He says we're going to work on this, but it's
Yes.
something that I'm willing to take on, and I want us to do because it's the right thing, right? Mm-hmm. And I just think that a lot of times we have this story on our mind where we're like, it'll be great when this happens. And I think one of the things that's really important is, like, even if we vote Trump out of office, it's not over.
No, definitely
right?
not. Definitely not.
It's not over, right? And so we have a long, hard future ahead of us, regardless of what happens in this election.
Yeah.
And we have a responsibility to see it done.
Yes, absolutely. Well, yeah.
That's your call to action, everyone.
Yeah, there it is.
That'll fix it all. No, Andre, any other points that we want to hit before we kind of jump in, take a quick break, and then join in our devotion and our gratitude for the episode? Any other major points from the episode?
No, I think that's it.
Perfect. All right, we will take a quick break, and we will be right back.
Right, everybody, we are back for our devotion, and I am so excited that Andre decided to stay for us for this part. We got fire is our element today. Fire is our element, and of course, we are trying to. The whole point of this devotion, if you've been listening, is to set a goal for ourselves, an intention, if you will, for the coming week about this. Through the lens of fire and nonviolent struggle. And so just a reminder for everybody, fire is this, think about fire from any perspective, whether it is something that's warming, whether it's something that's bold, whether it's something that can be damaging. Fire needs this element of control. You think about it needs fuel. There's just so many different aspects to think about. So however this comes to you, so I'm gonna throw it to Sunshine and ask him, like, Sunshine, what kind of a goal are you setting with the lens of fire and nonviolent struggle?
I think for me, maintaining a fire, and we've kind of talked about this before, you can't be passive about it. You can't just set everything up and kind of you can't put your sticks together and then light it and let it go. It's going to burn out if you don't tend it and keep taking care of it. The idea that Andre presented earlier about nonviolence not being passive, the misconception that it's passive, that you're not doing anything, is one that's important to highlight. I think for me, in my search to be more active, looking for more opportunities to learn about nonviolent struggle, educating myself on what those tools might be, and being able to use those tools in participating in protest or anything else like that is one that that I need to know more about and take an active role in doing. And so that's kind of my call to action for myself this upcoming week.
I love that. Andre, what are you feeling? How are you feeling? Do you have a goal for yourself?
I can't say that I do.
That's totally okay. Yeah, that's no worries. You might be able to help me with mine. So I listen to your podcast, and so I am a big fan. I've listened to all your episodes. You mentioned Serja, and Serja's that episode was really great. And there's so much content, right? And there's so much knowledge out there, and I'm learning even more in school right now. One of my classes is womanist theological ethics, so I'm really diving deep into womanism, which is an excellent thing for anybody to get into. But one of the things for me is I have been nurturing my own fire, and by reading and educating myself and learning. And one of the things that has continued to add fuel to that flame is your podcast, right? And what I want to do this week is, how do I start to bring more people to the fire, right? How do I spread this fire? How do I spread it in a way that is going to, I can't just carry a stick that's on fire and give it to somebody. I have to do it in a way where they're going to feel confident taking it on. They have to take, because fire can be scary. It can lead to dangerous things. But at the same time, how do I make sure that people are able to take it and then feel comfortable nurturing it and helping it grow themselves? So my goal is to recommend your podcast to 3 people. Say, hey, have you considered, I know this is a subject that you want to learn more about. Have you considered this as a resource? And so that's going to be my thing that I want to do this week.
I really appreciate that.
Yeah, no, for real. So one of the ways I'm going to do that is say, hey, everyone should listen to Andre's podcast. I'm saying it right now. Y'all should do it. Andre, where can they find you, just as a quick aside?
Oh, so the best place to find... well, I mean, you could go into your favorite podcatcher, obviously. If you go to Apple or Spotify or whatever, just type in Hope and Hard Pills. Or you could follow my email list, which you could find at my website, andrehenry.co. Every week, I send out a little bit of insight about social change from what I've been learning in my experiences. And whenever we have new podcast episodes, we send it out directly to your inbox.
I love that. Great. Cool. This kind of brings us to gratitude, which is really one of my favorite parts. I've said it before of the episode since we've started incorporating it. And I just love giving gratitude to people. So, Sunshine, do you want to go first? What's a moment, a person, somebody in the episode that you want to be grateful for?
Yes, I'm going to be grateful towards Ty Lee. That's my move.
We haven't talked about her.
I know. She's very small role in this.
She's not small.
She's a very small role in this episode.
Okay.
Ben. When we were talking about taking away resources, that really brought up chi blocking to me as a way that's almost as like a non-violent way to take away resources, and it is very defensive, and is how do we stop this attack from happening. And she teaches that to all the Kyoshi warriors as a way of kind of almost atoning for her past sins or struggles, which is, I think, just a really cool moment. And I love that she's kind of found a place to belong that's for her, and I want to give gratitude towards her. I think that she earned it. She gets it.
And what a great setup for chi blockers in Korra, y'all. I'm so excited to get to Korra. There's so much there. There's just so much
to get there.
And you remember we're to get there we need 50 Patreon supporters. We're getting close, and we really are looking forward to having y'all support us if you can.
That's the goal.
That was a little small aside. Sorry about that.
Patreon.com/BNB_pod.
Yep.
Fantastic. You get bonus episodes. You get
all kinds of stuff,
access
right?
to an online community. All these things.
Oh, man. Okay, sorry. Back to gratitude. Andre, would you like to share your moment, or would you like me to go first?
Sure, I can. And I mentioned this earlier. This is the thing that makes me love this series so much, is that moment where Aang decides that he's going to take away Ozai's bending rather than killing him. And so Aang is someone that I'm really grateful for in this episode.
Wow. I love Aang. He's just so great.
We honestly don't give him a lot of gratitude. We
don't.
Typically don't. And why not? Because he needs it.
In my head, I feel like he's the main character. I don't want to and so I feel like we naturally are picking lesser known, but Aang deserves all the gratitude, y'all. He's been great. I love him.
Such a hard decision. That was such a good for Aang.
I'm glad that you picked him because somebody should have.
Very true.
So we were talking offline for a minute, and I realized that a lot of Aang's non-violence, if you will, in this episode in particular, is rooted in the lessons from the lion turtle. And I really am. You talk about earlier, Andre, about all of the discipline required and the learning, and Aang had to be taught this. Aang had to learn this. Not only did he learn discipline from all the bending and all the stuff, but he had a teacher in the lion turtle that was able to give him this tool to be nonviolent. And I think that's critical. And so I am so grateful for the lion turtle and all of the teachers that are out there that are giving people tools to embrace and lean into nonviolence as a tactic moving forward.
Love that. Absolutely love that. All right, well that's it. That's our show. That's our season.
That's the
season.
Isn't that crazy?
That's it. We want to get to who knows? Book 1, Legend of Korra, might be coming your way.
We'll see.
That's the hope. But Andre, again, thank you so much for your time today and for taking this time to be with us and to talk about all of these important things. Can't say thank you enough. Everyone go check out the podcast Hope and Hard Pills. Wonderful, and again, thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure.
You're welcome back anytime.
Thanks for having me.
For sure.
Ben, anything you want to add before we head on out for the evening, for the day, whatever time you're listening to this podcast?
Just, I'm also grateful for Max. This season has been infinitely better because of Max.
Yeah. Max, we love you. We'll see you back here in the studio soon. Well, once again, I'm Sunshine Mayfield.
And this has been Pruitt.
And this has been Bending, Not Breaking. Thank you for listening.